Akron, Ohio. A Tuesday morning in the spring of 1952, the shift whistle at the Goodyear plant sounds at 5:47 a.m., not 6, not 5:30, but 5:47 because the mixing floors need exactly 13 minutes to reach operating temperature before the first worker touches a machine. That detail alone tells you something about the scale of what was built here. This was not a factory that ran on instinct. It ran on precision. Thousands of interlocking decisions made every hour, every shift, every day for over a century. Walk past the plant today and the silence hits you differently than you'd expect. Not peaceful, heavy, the kind of silence that only exists where enormous sound once lived. The skeletal remains of production halls, rusted frameworks, and courtyards where men and women in rubber-soaked gloves once moved with practiced urgency, all of it still standing, all of it still. This is the story of how one factory became a city's heartbeat, and how that heartbeat stopped. Franklin Augustus Seiberling was born in 1859 in Western Star, Ohio, a name so small it barely registers on a state map. Nothing about his early years suggested he would reshape American industry. He was not an engineer, not a chemist, not a man with technical credentials. What he had was something harder to teach: the ability to see value in things other people had already walked away from. In 1898, Seiberling traveled to Chicago and came back with a deal on 2 abandoned factories on Market Street in Akron. Empty buildings, previous tenants gone. Most businessmen in his position would have kept looking. Instead, he called his brother Charles, and together they signed the papers. They named the company after Charles Goodyear, the 19th century inventor who discovered vulcanization, the chemical process that transformed raw rubber from a material that melted in summer and cracked in winter into something durable enough to carry the weight of a moving civilization. Goodyear himself died bankrupt in 1860, never profiting from his own discovery. Seiberling knew the name. He used it anyway, part tribute, part ambition. The first products were humble: horseshoe pads, bicycle tires, rubber poker chips, sealing rings for canning jars. Not the stuff of legend. But Seiberling was not building for 1898. He was building for the moment he could see coming, a country about to fall in love with the automobile. By 1906, just 8 years after founding, Goodyear had become the dominant force in the American tire market. The man had looked at 2 empty factories and built an empire. What he could not control was what came after. Akron was not chosen by accident. The city already had B.F. Goodrich operating since the 1870s, which meant a trained workforce familiar with rubber manufacturing, something you cannot build overnight. The Little Cuyahoga River ran nearby, providing water access for industrial processes. The B&O railroad lines cut through the city, connecting raw material suppliers to the south and auto manufacturers to the north. Raw rubber came from Southeast Asia and South America, thousands of miles away. But Akron's rail network made it work. Finished tires could reach Detroit, Chicago, and New York without the week-long delays that plagued less connected manufacturing cities. Geography is often destiny in industrial history, and Akron's geography was almost perfectly calibrated for what Seiberling needed. The early factory on Market Street was small enough that a single overseer could see the entire operation from one end. Within a decade, that was no longer possible. As the automobile boom accelerated after 1905, Goodyear's workforce multiplied so fast that the company had to build housing just to keep workers close enough to show up on time. By the 1910s, Akron's population had nearly doubled, drawn by the promise of steady factory wages. Goodyear alone employed thousands. Other rubber companies followed: Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, General Tire, until the city wasn't just producing tires, it was producing the industry itself, the rubber capital of the world, a title earned in less than 20 years from a deal on 2 abandoned buildings. The plant that existed in 1920 bore almost no resemblance to the one Seiberling had opened in 1898. New mixing halls, expanded vulcanization chambers, laboratory facilities where chemists experimented with rubber compounds around the clock, testing tracks where finished tires were run under controlled stress conditions to measure durability at speeds and loads that the original factory never anticipated. The workforce grew from dozens to thousands, and with that scale came a kind of industrial choreography that had to be seen to be understood. Mixing rooms where raw rubber was blended with sulfur, carbon black, and chemical agents. Pressing rooms where that blended material was shaped under enormous hydraulic force. Curing chambers hot enough that workers wore protective gear even on cold Ohio mornings. Inspection floors at the end of the line where finished tires were tested for uniformity, balance, and structural integrity before being shipped. Every stage depended on the one before it. A timing error in the mixing room could ruin an entire curing batch hours later. A temperature deviation in the press could produce tires that looked correct, but would fail under load. I've read accounts from longtime Goodyear engineers who described the plant less like a factory and more like a living organism, one where thousands of individual decisions, made by thousands of individual workers, had to align perfectly for production to function. By the mid-1910s, Goodyear was supplying tires not just for automobiles and trucks, but for early aviation. The Wright brothers era had given way to military aviation demand, and Goodyear moved into that space aggressively. The factory that began making horseshoe pads was now producing components that went up with aircraft. The ambition had always been there. The scale was finally catching up to it. By the 1920s, Akron produced more rubber products than any other city on Earth. Not more than any other American city. More than any city anywhere. That is a remarkable concentration of industrial power for a place that most of the country couldn't locate on a map. The city's identity became inseparable from the factories. Streets near the plant were named for production processes, for company founders, for departments. Schools adjusted their calendars around shift schedules. Churches held services in staggered times to accommodate workers coming off nights. The factory did not exist inside the city. In many ways, the city existed inside the factory. The workforce that sustained this dominance came from everywhere. Rural Ohio, West Virginia, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Slovakia, immigrant communities that had heard Akron offered steady wages and steady work. What they found was both. Long hours, physically brutal conditions, real danger from machinery and chemicals, but also a paycheck that came every week, a union that had learned to negotiate, and neighborhoods where everyone around you understood exactly what your workday felt like. Competition between Goodyear, Firestone, and B.F. Goodrich drove innovation at a pace that benefited the entire industry. If Goodyear developed a new tire compound that performed better in wet conditions, Firestone had to respond. If Firestone patented a more efficient curing process, Goodyear had engineers reverse engineering the concept within months. The rubber capital wasn't just a location, it was an ecosystem. And for several decades, it was the most productive industrial ecosystem in the world. The factory floor ran on a logic of its own. The stamping presses operated in a rhythm, a mechanical pulse that workers internalized after a few weeks, until they stopped hearing it as sound and started feeling it as something closer to a heartbeat. Veterans could tell by the sound of a press whether the temperature was right, whether the compound was behaving correctly, whether a shutdown was coming before any instrument registered the problem. That kind of knowledge didn't come from a manual, it came from years. Apprentices shadowed experienced workers through entire production cycles before being trusted to operate independently. The chemistry of rubber manufacturing is not forgiving. A few degrees of temperature deviation, a slight variation in compound ratio, and the batch is lost. Workers carried this awareness with them through every hour of every shift. The physical demands were constant. Mixing rooms ran hot enough that workers lost several pounds of water weight in a single shift. The smell of vulcanizing rubber was so present, so specific, that former Goodyear employees report being able to identify it decades later from across a parking lot. Long-term exposure to the chemicals used in compound mixing created health risks that the company and the medical establishment were slow to acknowledge. And yet, the accounts from workers who spent decades inside that plant are not primarily accounts of suffering. They are accounts of pride. The knowledge that a tire made in Akron was on a vehicle crossing the American continent. The satisfaction of a shift completed without incident. The particular camaraderie of people who share a difficult thing and come through it together day after day, year after year. The warning signs didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, the way structural problems always do, as small inefficiencies, as equipment that required slightly more maintenance than it once did, as production targets that were met but only just. Foreign manufacturers entered the American tire market in the late 1950s and early 1960s with products that were cheaper to produce. Radial tire technology, pioneered by Michelin in Europe, offered performance advantages that Goodyear's existing production lines were not designed to accommodate. Retooling for radials meant capital investment at a scale that required difficult decisions about which facilities to upgrade and which to phase out. The sections of the Akron plant that had been built for mid-century production methods began to show their age not in dramatic breakdowns, but in accumulating small failures. Lines that ran at 94% capacity one year ran at 87% the next. Warehouses that once turned inventory in days began holding finished stock for weeks. But these are the kinds of numbers that take years to become visible as a trend, and by the time the trend is undeniable, the momentum is already established. Workers felt it before management acknowledged it. The informal networks on the factory floor, the conversations between shifts, the observations of veterans who had seen the plant at its peak, registered the change before any quarterly report did. The question was never whether the shift was happening. The question was how fast and what it would leave behind. By the 1980s, the Akron plant was operating as a fragment of what it had been. Assembly lines that once ran 3 shifts were consolidated to 1. Entire wings of the complex, production halls that had employed hundreds, were idled, their machinery disconnected, their floors going dark. Goodyear as a corporation survived. But it restructured, relocated production to lower-cost facilities, modernized certain operations, and remained a globally competitive tire company. But the original plant, the sprawling industrial complex on the banks of the Little Cuyahoga that had defined American tire manufacturing for nearly a century, could not be saved through restructuring. It could only be managed in its contraction. The human cost was not abstract. Workers who had spent 30 years on the floor faced early retirement packages and the sudden, disorienting reality that the institution they had organized their lives around was dissolving. Communities built around shift schedules found those schedules disappearing. Local businesses that had run on factory wages for generations adjusted to a reality that no adjustment fully addressed. What remained operational continued to produce. But walking through those final years, you were never unaware that you were watching something end. The active lines and the silent ones existed side by side. the working present and the industrial past occupying the same physical space, divided only by whether the overhead lights were still on. There's a specific quality to industrial abandonment that photographs almost capture but never quite do. It's the scale. A single rusted press the size of a small house, sitting in a room the size of a city block, under a ceiling 40 feet above the floor, the silence in a space that was built for the opposite of silence. The abandoned sections of the Goodyear plant accumulated their own kind of archaeology, conveyor belts that sagged and finally tore under their own weight. So storage rooms where molds and tooling sat exactly where they'd been left, covered in a decade of dust. The faint, persistent smell of rubber compounds embedded in the concrete floors, a smell that does not leave, that outlasts the machines that produced it. Broken windows let in weather. Water worked its way into structural elements designed for heat and vibration, not moisture. Paint peeled from ceiling beams in long, curling strips. The rust that spread across metal frameworks was not dramatic. It was patient, thorough, indifferent to what the metal had once been part of. People who worked in those halls during their active years and returned later describe a specific disorientation. The space is recognizable and unrecognizable at once. The architecture is the same. The distances are the same. Yeah, but the thing that made it what it was is gone, and in its absence the space becomes something else entirely, a monument maybe, or just a very large reminder that nothing built by human hands is built to last forever. Demolition is less dramatic than it sounds. The dismantling of the Goodyear plant was not a single event. It was a sequence of administrative decisions spread across years, each one removing a section that could no longer justify its maintenance costs or meet modern safety standards. Buildings that had housed rubber mixing operations were decommissioned first, their machinery disconnected, power cut, interiors stripped of salvageable components, then the structures themselves assessed for removal. What the assessments revealed was the layered history of the plant's own construction. Thick brick walls from the early 1900s, standing alongside steel frame additions from the 1940s and 1950s. Each generation of building reflecting the industrial standards and pressures of its moment. The oldest structures came down first, unable to meet modern requirements for electrical systems, floor load capacity, or environmental containment. They were the most expensive to maintain and the least adaptable to new use. Watching them come down, residents of Akron were watching something more than buildings being removed. They were watching a skyline they had grown up with being dismantled piece by piece without ceremony. What the demolition crews uncovered as they worked was the true scale of what had been built. Miles of industrial piping running through concrete floors, reinforced foundations designed to absorb continuous vibration from machines that no longer existed, chemical residues in certain sections that required specialized decommissioning before any other work could proceed. The factory had been embedded in the city's physical structure in ways that took years and significant resources to fully undo. Goodyear, the corporation, did not disappear with the Akron plant. It exists today, producing tires at facilities across the world, running advanced research operations, competing in global markets. The name that Cyberling borrowed from a bankrupt 19th century inventor is still on tires that roll across every continent. But the physical place where that name was built, the factory on the Little Cuyahoga, the streets that organized themselves around shift schedules, the neighborhoods that grew up in the shadow of production halls, that place carries a different kind of legacy, one that belongs less to the corporation and more to the people who spent their working lives inside those walls. There is something in the accounts of longtime Goodyear workers that resists easy categorization. Pride in what was built, grief at what was lost. A clear-eyed acknowledgement that the forces that ended the plant's dominance were larger than any individual decision, any single failure of management or labor or vision. The global economy shifted, technology shifted. The cost structures that made centralized mass production in Akron viable in 1920 made it unsustainable by 1990. These are not failures, they are patterns. The same patterns that have shaped industrial cities from Manchester to Detroit to Osaka. What Akron built was real. The tires that came out of those factories carried a country across itself for a century. The workers who made them built a city, raised families, created institutions that still exist. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly what legacy means. Not a monument that endures unchanged, but an influence that continues to move through the world long after the original force has stilled. The factory is mostly gone now. What remains is what always remains. The shape of a place that was built around something, and the memory of what that something was.